So in just minutes, a House committee will hold a virtual hearing on the nationwide threat of domestic terrorism following the attack on the U.S. Capitol. Lawmakers on the Homeland Security panel will be hearing testimony from key witnesses, including the director of the Homeland Security and Emergency Management Agency, Christopher Rodriguez, and former DHS Assistant for Counterterrorism and Threat Prevention, Elizabeth Newman. For more, let us bring in CBS News senior investigative correspondent Catherine Herridge and CBS News reporter Nicole Sganga, who covers the Justice Department. Thank you so much for joining us, ladies. I'm going to start with Catherine. What can we expect from today's hearing?
Anne-Marie, we expect the hearing this morning to focus on domestic violent extremists, what law enforcement calls DVEs. The acting U.S. attorney here in Washington, Michael Sherwin, who leads the sedition task force, has already indicted members of the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, and the 3 Percenters. What's key here is what's called aspirational thinking and crossing this threshold to violence. So we expect witnesses to drill down on this idea of what took individuals who were thinking about violent activity to cross that threshold or that red line to violent actions on January 6th. I've been covering this area for 2 decades, and I can tell you that right after 9/11, there was a view within law enforcement and the intelligence community that individuals had to have this in-person contact, kind of the mentoring experience to cross that threshold to violent activity. But what we saw after 9/11 with radicalization of Americans with ISIS and Al-Qaeda is that they were able to cross that threshold virtually with the internet. So the question here is, are the same mechanisms for radicalization that we saw after 9/11 with foreign terrorist groups also at play with extremist groups here inside the United States?
That is fascinating. It'll be interesting to learn what they uncover. Nicole, what kind of insight will the witnesses provide when it comes to domestic terrorism and more specifically the insurrection at the Capitol?
Well, one of the things that stood out to us, Vlad and Anne-Marie, as we looked over this list of key witnesses, were a lot of these folks are former officials or think tank leaders. You know, that's in part due to the ongoing nature of these investigations. One name that did stand out to us, you mentioned him earlier, Christopher Rodriguez. He is the Homeland Security and Emergency Management Agency director in the District of Columbia. Lawmakers will want to know from him, you know, about some of the security planning and preparations, what steps were taken to mitigate violence ahead of January 6th. Why did things not pan out? Of course, 2021 was an unprecedented and is an unprecedented year in so many ways, but these kinds of large-scale gatherings, protests, even marches are not uncommon in the District of Columbia. Yes, it is, you know, a complicated web of law enforcement agencies that are responsible for protecting the Capitol, but they're used to working with one another, and certainly this gathering at the Capitol was not a surprise by any means. Rioters had discussed their plans, broadcasting them on social media. You know, I think one of the other questions that will be discussed is what did some of the intelligence assessments prior to January 6th really indicate, and looking, you know, beyond January 6th as well, how much effort was really devoted to confronting domestic violent extremism as it emerged? And that might be a question for Elizabeth Newman. I think also lawmakers are going to be pressing to determine who is responsible here, separating some of the leaders who might have, you know, incited this violence at the Capitol from those who got swept up within the riots. You know, certainly looking for those individuals who should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. And lastly, I think many of these key witnesses, particularly some of our think tank experts, are going to be looking to not only recount the events of January 6th, but make policy recommendations to make sure that this never happens again.
Catherine, we talked earlier about this, that the Pentagon has ordered a military-wide stand down over the next 60 days to tackle this question of extremism within the ranks. So twofold, just what exactly does the stand down look like? And, you know, the issue of extremism, it's not new. This conversation has popped up periodically over the last few decades, as a matter of fact. So why now? Why the stand down? Why is it of paramount concern now?
Well, the Pentagon spokesman told reporters yesterday that January 6th was really a wake-up call because of the number of individuals with connections to the military who allegedly participated in the attack. This stand down will be a pause phased over the 60 days so it won't disrupt military operations. And the objective is twofold. One, for military leadership to communicate directly with the men and women who serve under them what their expectations are in terms of behavior and extremist ideology. But I think also significantly, it will be a chance for military leadership to listen to the rank and file, to get their arms around the depth and breadth, the scope of extremist ideology within the military. And just as a final point, based on our review here at CBS News of military service records and court documents, at least 16 individuals who were arrested were veterans, and 2 others at that time were serving in the Army Reserve.
So, Catherine, let me just ask you a follow-up on that. I wonder I guess the question is, how is the military going to be assessing this? Because, I mean, you're talking about a slippery slope. If a soldier or sailor, Marine, or an airman, first of all, let's remember that often the rank and file are fairly young. We're talking about folks anywhere from age 18 to their early 30s. If somebody posted something when they were a kid, when they were 14 or 15 years old, or if somebody did something that was questionable before they joined the military, is that going to be scrutinized? I'm just trying to understand what they're looking for and how they can make an assessment as to whether or not somebody actually holds an extremist view or not.
Well, these are all great questions. Reporters pressed the Pentagon spokesperson yesterday about the mechanics of this and what the rollout will look like and how they're going to take what they learned and implement it in a meaningful way. They were short on detail. I think we'll know more in the coming weeks, but their bottom line is that they want military leadership to communicate directly what their expectations are. And then significantly, they want to be listening to understand how broad an issue this is within the ranks.
One more question for you, Catherine. I mentioned that this has come up before. Have they done, previous studies? Have they looked into it? Some of the reading that I saw indicated that, the last studies were like a couple of decades ago.
Well, that is one of the criticisms, which is that it's been understood that it is an issue within the military. So why did it happen now? And I think the clear answer from the Pentagon is that January 6th was a wake-up call for them, as it was really for the nation in terms of extremist ideology. And I will couple that with the fact that we had that recent very public warning from Homeland Security that they didn't have specific or credible intelligence about plotting, but they warned that more violent activity was indeed possible against elected officials and federal facilities, and that this is not just a January, February, March 2021 problem, but this is the leading threat indicator domestically in this country, really for the foreseeable future.
So, Nicole, the DOJ is reportedly considering using a federal statute designed to take down mafia rings and organized crime to prosecute Capitol rioters. Tell me about that.
Yeah, it's called the RICO statute. It stands for Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations. It was created back in the 1970s and first used by the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York in a 1979 case, the United States versus Scotto. Anthony Scotto was a New York mobster and a labor union racketeer, part of the Gambino crime family. But fast forward now 4 decades, and the goal here is the same. If pursued, prosecutors will be looking to convict leaders of the Capitol Hill siege who ordered other people to commit crimes. The statute comes with some very weighty penalties, up to 20 years in prison and seizures of assets that were obtained illegally through a criminal enterprise. And when prosecutors present their case, they'll have to account for some specific elements. So, for example, they must show a pattern of racketeering. When we think of racketeering, we often think of murder, bribery, money laundering, but obstructing an official government proceeding is also considered racketeering. Certainly, we know that on January 6th, lawmakers were in the midst of certifying the 2020 election results. And when it comes to proving a sort of pattern of behavior, prosecutors are going to have to go beyond January 6th when they're looking at some of these defendants, seeing if perhaps some of them participated in other similar events, like, for instance, the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally back in 2017. Prosecutors are also going to have to prove that some of these far-right extremist groups are in fact criminal enterprises. Now, we should point out with this Reuters report, CBS News is looking into it. Our understanding is that no final decision has been made by the Justice Department. But if and when the Justice Department chooses to pursue this avenue, these are very complicated cases. We could be looking at months, if not years, of ongoing litigation.
Catherine, a little bit of a different topic, but an overlap for sure. Discrimination. We talked earlier about the fact that the Navy had put together a task force to look at discrimination within the Navy. That task force, I can say that probably, issued a report with a list of recommendations. Can you talk to us a little bit about the report, the task force, why they did it, what they kind of uncovered?
Well, the Navy Task Force released nearly 60 recommendations, Anne-Marie, and they addressed everything from sexism within the Navy to also hate speech, discrimination, and issues of bias. I think in our reporting, it's a very lengthy document, and I would encourage people at home to read it for themselves. It really goes to a number of issues related to promotion within the military. What they showed in the document is that about 77% of senior officers within the Navy are white, and that's in line with the census data. But when you drill down on minorities, blacks and Hispanics, they are really underrepresented still at this stage. So it's an effort by the Navy to identify the issues in a very concrete way and then try and move forward with steps to address it effectively.
Also, Catherine, you've done a lot of reporting on the investigations going on with regards to some of the insurrectionists. And, we've seen some interesting stories across the board. For example, we know that the guy who calls himself the QAnon shaman, for example, has offered to testify during the impeachment hearings of President Trump. There was one woman, I think it was the one, Anne-Marie, that, flew to the insurrection in a private jet, who also then wanted to go to Mexico on a vacation, even though she was still, I guess on probation or, I
think that was approved.
And it was approved, right, Catherine? So what's going on? I mean, when will we start to see the wheels of justice turning for some of these individuals who were there and took part in the insurrection?
Well, just for some context, we're only a month away from January 6th. And based on my reporting here at CBS News, this is probably one of the largest federal investigations in U.S. history in terms of the scope, the number of individuals who are being investigated, and then also the resources that are being committed. Over 170 individuals have been charged with federal crimes, and the FBI and investigators have opened more than 400 case files. So they're looking at least 400 individuals for acts that occurred on January 6th. What I would say sort of is the bottom line for me so far is that what we're seeing to emerge is that though it seemed like there was a lot of chaos on the day of January 6th, we're seeing some discrete groups that were working in a coordinated way and in a premeditated way. Some of them, it's alleged, started their planning shortly after the November election. And we're talking about groups largely that fall into this militia bucket. So the Oath Keepers, the 3 Percenters, and the Proud Boys. So while it seemed chaotic and it seemed disorganized, what we're starting to see as we peel back the layers here is that there was a degree, an alleged degree of organization and coordination. And if you think back to some of our initial reporting here at CBS News, we were told from a senior law enforcement official that they were very focused on groups that were using these military-style tactics or movements, formations, going into the Capitol. And what we've now seen is charges brought against some of these individuals. And again, that goes to the idea that it wasn't sort of a pickup game on the day, that this is something that had a lot of forethought and coordination and, in fact, some fundraising before the event.
So the question that I would have as this starts to come to light, Catherine, would be, to what end? In other words, we've all, as reporters, we've covered coups in other countries, we've covered attempted coups, and generally, we just saw what happened in Myanmar, right? The military initiated a coup, and what do you hit? You hit media. You know, you shut down the media, and if you can control the military, well, that's a win, right? But even if the FBI and the DOJ is picking up a thread that indicates that there was some level of organization, but I'm still not clear, like, to what end. What they would have brought Mike Pence out and done what? Or if they had, gotten their hands on Speaker Pelosi, then what? I mean, it's still, so that'll be interesting to me, I think, and to the rest of the country to understand if there was some kind of coordination, what the ultimate plan was.
Well, what I would say to you and to folks at home is that when you look at these federal prosecutions, you have to remember what we're seeing as a starting point are initial charges, which really amount to holding charges. It's kind of the low-hanging fruit. So, for example, allegations of unauthorized entry into a restricted area, that would be the Capitol. But then what investigators are doing now is that they're drilling deeper than just the social media postings and video on YouTube to try and understand how much planning and premeditation was involved and how much coordination between other individuals. That's why we started to see what I think are the most significant cases, which are these conspiracy cases involving groups of individuals. And I know, based on my conversations with individuals involved in the Sedition Task Force here in Washington, is that they want to make sure that if they bring criminal charges, that they will be able to prove them in a court of law so that they can get the maximum sentence possible. So their objective is to create a deterrent effect, if you will. If you act out like this in the future, which is what the intelligence bulletins are warning is possible, folks will understand that there is a severe criminal penalty for these actions if they are caught and prosecuted.
All right. Catherine Herridge, Nicole Sganga, always great to have both of you. Thank you so much for your reporting and analysis. We appreciate it as always.